Watch Why Socialism Always Fails by North Star Radio.
Said that some of you are communists. That is a very unpopular term today. The Soviet Union is a matter of practical fact. The practical fact known to you and known to all the world is run by a dictatorship.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile.
Isn't it crazy that all of America's enemies always happen to be totalitarian dictatorships? It's just crazy how America, regardless of how many actual totalitarian authoritarian dictatorships that they've aligned with, planted, armed, trained, defended, it's always the enemies that are secretly much worse totalitarian dictatorship. It's so cool. It's convenient, and it's so cool that they're always on the right side. America's always on the right side of history, and our enemies are always on the wrong side of history.
Launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union is engaged in a relentless military buildup, overtaking and surpassing the United States in major categories of military power, acquiring what can only be considered an offensive military capability.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
During these last few months, you and I have witnessed one of the greatest dramas of the 20th century, the historic and revolutionary transformation of a totalitarian dictatorship, the Soviet Union, and the liberation of its peoples.
Sadly, because Mr. Milosevic has negotiated agreements which he has then ignored, I have supported the NATO bombings of military targets.
China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. They can't figure out how they're going to deal with the corruption that exists within the system. I mean, they're not bad folks, but guess what? They're not. I spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader had by the time we left office. This is a guy who doesn't have a democratic with a small d bone in his body. This is a guy who is a thug who, in fact, has 1 million Uyghurs in reconstruction camps, meaning concentration camps. This is the guy who
he's reconstructing them. He's constructing them and reconstructing them. It's crazy. He just keeps he rebuilds them. It's wild.
See what's happening right now in
it's really cool that Biden obviously is the #1 defender of Muslims, as we all know. Famously, he loves Muslims and wants to protect them. And he has stopped Xi Jinping from the Muslim reconstruction that took place.
Hong Kong.
And Beijing's actions continue to undermine the rules-based order and threaten the sovereignty of nations.
Yeah.
In 1970, in the mountainous South American country of Chile, a presidential election was underway, where 83% of the country turned out to vote. Representing the Popular Unity Party, Salvador Allende.
Yeah, I'm the Breaking Bad meme in the car going, no, don't vote. Don't vote for democratic socialism. Don't do it. No, they'll kill you. The OG 9/11 chat.
A socialist came out on top, beating out his competition by a mere 1% of the vote. Interesting. And after only 3 years, on September 11th, 1973, communist dictator Salvador Allende was kicked out of office by the people he brutally ruled over. Why? Because socialism never works.
It's true. He's right.
In 1983, in the former West African country of Upper Volta, a violent coup d'etat led by communist Pan-African terrorist Thomas Sankara ousted the democratically elected government. After gaining control and naming himself prime minister, Thomas Sankara changed the country's name to Burkina Faso, land of the proud people.
Totally unacceptable. What are they proud of? Socialism? You shouldn't be proud of that. Okay? You should have been the country of the shameful people because of socialism.
Proud of what? I ask. But after only 5 years of violently ruling over his own people and doing absolutely nothing else, he was killed by the same people he claimed to represent. Why? Because socialism never works.
Yeah.
In 1953, in the Southeast Asian country of Korea, after 3 years of the US military trying to emancipate its people from communist rule, the USSR-backed northern half of Korea split from South Korea due to Soviet pressure. And to this day, they continue to live under communist rule under the brutal Kim regime. And we all know how that's going, because socialism never works.
True, thank God. Thank God someone is brave enough to say these truths. Thank God.
17. In the beautiful monarchical...
Is this guy serious? No, chat. Why would I watch a video like this? Like, please, 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 please. It's not... No, it's North Star Radio. He's making a point, a broader point. He's being sarcastic, okay?
Russia. A violent mob of left-wing terrorists known as the Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian...
He's serious, dumbass.
monarchy, ousting Tsar Nicholas II and brutally ending his entire lineage. Nearly 80 years.
That was so unacceptable, honestly. Can you imagine the peaceful Tsar ruling over this vast land in the kindest ways possible? Famously, okay? Famously, a much gentler monarchy. And all of a sudden, these peasants, they just rise up. These people, they just rise up in arms and take up arms against the peaceful, benevolent monarch. Like, what has he done? Nothing wrong. Nothing wrong at all. And then they just have this revolution. Gross. Grow up, okay? Things would have been so much better.
Past of Russian communist rule, while at the same time invading and implementing communism throughout Europe, Asia.
Better an enslaved peasant in desperate squalor than a worker with pretty decent living conditions? That's what I'm saying, dude. What? Like, oh, what's next? You're going to talk about how the Tsar was consistently implementing pogroms? Like, ugh, whatever, dude. Some people have bad vibes, okay? Many of them happen to be Jewish. But the Tsar, he knew what was right from wrong. Duh. Some people are traitors. Like, what are you supposed to do? You can't go against the mandate of heaven. A person who is appointed by God, anointed by God. What? Oh my God, what's next, dude? You're gonna tell me that men can't have hobbies like building 150 pipe bombs like the guy in Virginia? Thank God they let him go.
America, ever encroaching on the last bit of democracy in the West. But after 80 years of brutal communist oppression, the Russian people finally had enough, rising up against their brutal dictatorship in the name of democracy, liberty, and justice for all.
Yeah, and everybody knows the liberalization of the Soviet bloc was fantastic. I'll explain. When they were doing when suicide rates went up by like 7 million %, and an entire region of the planet basically fell into squalor, okay, and tried to, I guess, self-medicate by killing themselves by drinking way too much alcohol. And there was child trafficking and sex slavery around. This was actually good. I'll explain. It's sometimes good to go through, the hard times because it creates strong men, right? I've seen that meme online somewhere. Hard times create strong men create good times, and then good times create weak men, and weak men create bad times. It's just growing pains, right? That's just how it works.
Their decades of suffering were truly brought to conclusion by the destruction of the Berlin Wall and the liberation of West Berlin. How did the fiercest communist regime in the history of the world eventually collapse by the mere power of its oppressed people? Because socialism never works.
It's true. Facts. True facts stated.
But after the fall of the Soviet Union, one communist dictatorship remained in Europe, that being Yugoslavia, a land made up of several ethnic and cultural groups. But only a few months after the fall of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia collapsed from within. Why? Say it with me now.
Socialism never works.
Socialism never works.
Yeah, it's true.
Gentleman from Vermont's recognized.
Rest in power, Tito.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution is very clear. It is the United States Congress which has the power to determine issues of war and peace and to decide whether our young men and women are put in harm's way. It is the President who is the Commander-in-Chief of the military. It is the Congress which determines whether we use that military. I have heard today that some people think that the U.S. participation in Kosovo now is unconstitutional. They're right. But the U.S. participation in Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, and many other conflicts which took place without congressional authorization were also unconstitutional. Sadly, because Mr. Milosevic has negotiated agreements which he has then ignored, I have supported the NATO bombings of military targets.
Sorry, I'm stupid as hell. I'm still a normie, truly, but Tito was a dictator, right? I feel like saying that about under American education, under Western education, saying that about like virtually every other leader that oversaw any sort of like socialist governance is understandable, given how much education is out there talking about how devastating these guys were. But Tito is like famously one of those dudes that is supposed to be an in-betweener, you know, cooperation with the West, and also cooperation with, to a certain degree, Soviet-aligned countries as well. It's interesting to say this about him ultimately, because it's like he was, you know, he was definitely someone who worked with the West a lot.
At one point in time, Earth had no socialism. Then we were taken over, engulfed by socialism, until today, when almost no socialism exists on Earth. Why is that? This is the history of socialism. Vladimir Lenin is viewed as the father of socialism, the man who orchestrated the October Revolution. A group of anti-capitalist Bolshevik terrorists stormed the Winter Palace and brutally ended the Romanov lineage, and after doing so, implemented communism all throughout Russia. For the next 60 or so years, Russia was catastrophic for the underdeveloped world. Invasion after invasion, Russia was spreading communism all throughout the globe, like it was an infectious disease searching through every alley and stairwell for its next victim, steadily building what we now know as the Soviet Union. Spanning all the way from Soviet-backed North Korea to the Soviet Republic of East Germany, the USSR had a chokehold on freedom and independence, even going as far as to invade Afghanistan, an inhumane act for the sole purpose of spreading communism. This was truly a dark time in Earth's history. However, for whatever reason, one by one these communist dictatorships began to collapse, turning away from the dark side overnight. The USSR, done. East Germany, collapsed. Vietnam, cooked. Chile, donezo. Yugoslavia, bye-bye. And just like that, good was returned to this earth. But that's easy. That's understood. That's just history. The reason I'm here today is to answer the one question that is on everyone's mind. Why did these countries collapse? How did these countries collapse? Did society just become lazy? Maybe no one wanted to work because everything was handed to them. Were these dictators hoarding all the wealth for themselves and their friends? A phenomenon all too common in the history of these socialist countries?
And something that does not exist in capitalism, famously. Okay? I just want to reiterate the point. The accumulation of wealth at the top in the hands of the few. Okay? This famously is not a product of the dictatorship of the bourgeois. They know better. They are producers. They are wealth producers. They know what to do with the money. You and other peasants like you do not understand. You will never understand how difficult of a journey it is, how difficult of a process it is to actually make capital accumulate. You can't, if given to you, all of that wealth, if distributed evenly, if distributed across the laboring class, by virtue of how much they're actually contributing to the output, how much they're actually contributing to the value, that would be devastating, completely devastating, because you would just squander it. You would buy, I don't know, silly things like Warhammer 40K figurines or something. That's what you would do. Whereas the wealthy, they know how to use it.
This is why socialism always fails. Today's broadcast is brought to you by viewers like you. Become a member today and unlock exclusive content at patreon.com/NorthstarRadio.
Yeah, like think about it. This is a good point. Can you imagine how hard it is to buy Twitter for $46 billion way above market rate as for a joke, as a meme, and then only trying to back out of it, and then having the Delaware, Chamber of Commerce court or whatever force your hand into actually fulfilling the conditions of the agreement? And purchasing Twitter at this incredibly high price point, and then immediately gutting the entirety of the workforce, destroying any revenue opportunities you might have had, utilizing this massive social media platform as your own personal cumsock, while simultaneously tweeting 1,000 times a day. Do you know how difficult that is? You think you could be able to do such a thing? No, of course not. It takes a master of the craft to be able to put together such a fantastic opportunity. A mere peasant like you does not know what it's like to tweet 1,000 times a day. Elon, on the other hand, is a genius.
Take a closer look at the history of communist Chile to hopefully find a source, a reason, a catalyst, as they say, for its collapse. In 1973, Chile elected communist dictator Salvador Allende, but only a week after Allende took...
Why are you being so condescending? I will buy your house when my Funko Pop investments, not a toy collection, take off. Stop. I'm fearful. I'm fearful of the market value of your Funko Pop collection growing every single day.
Office, communist Chile's entire economy collapsed, and so did Salvador Allende's reign. But why? Why did communism work so poorly for Chile that their entire economy and society collapsed in only a week of Allende taking...
Thank God the United States of America was there to save the beautiful people of Chile from making a mistake. They democratically elected this guy, not realizing how scary and bad it is, and how they would be in a brutal authoritarian dictatorship. So I think America wanted to show the people of Chile a lesson. They wanted them to understand that it would be really bad if you had a democratically elected socialist leader. So what's really better is to liberate you from that and then plant a puppet dictator who will do brutal military dictatorship stuff. But that's only as a lesson, to show you how bad it could have been if Salvador Allende did those things.
taking office.
Yeah.
Well, Communist Chile was quick to implement government handouts. Left and right, they threw money at every poor, sick, hungry, desperate individual they could find on the street.
Unacceptable.
And overnight... Yeah, I lied. The true reason socialism always fails is because socialism never gets the opportunity
he lied?
to not fail.
Wait, what?
Sure, the Bolsheviks were definitionally terrorists. But the idea that all resistance is unjust is a silly concept. Life in the Russian Empire, ruled by the Romanov family, was not a fun time, especially leading up to the revolution. World War I was ongoing, and however you choose to frame...
I'm confused. This plot twist. What? I'm scared. I'm scared. Why is this guy lying? Why is this guy lying? I don't like this. I'm scared.
This was an imperial war, a war between monarchies, fighting over who can control which parts of the globe. And these brutal self-interested monarchs did everything they could to win over their disputed territories, including, but not limited to, sending millions of their own peasantry to die in the war. Russia alone saw 2 million soldiers die in World War I, and due to the mass amounts of money being spent on the war, along with the gross amounts of wealth the Romanovs were hoarding in their winter palace, another 1 million Russians indirectly died from the war due to food shortages and disease. An event like the October...
No, but that was good. That was for good reasons, as opposed to the bad reasons that these guys were doing terrorism.
Revolution doesn't happen in a vacuum. This was a deeply brutal monarchy, hoarding wealth and leaving their supposed people in ruin and famine for the sole purpose of their imperial pleasure. And once the working class of Russia seized power from their brutal monarchy, the United States immediately did everything they could to squash the Bolshevik government and any sort of spread of communist values, as it was a threat to their colonial profits. During the Russian Civil War, fought between Bolshevik revolutionaries and the remaining factions of pro-monarchy Russians known as the White Army, the United States supported the White Army with money, weapons...
Wait, what? I don't understand. Why would the United States do that? What's next? You're going to tell me that the United States also supported logistically the Batista regime in Cuba when the Cubans also were having their own revolution later, you know? Decades later? There's no way. Stop. What's next? Are you going to say that America planted a puppet dictatorship, a military dictatorship in Chile, the one that you just talked about beforehand? There is no way. America is never on the wrong side of these things. I don't understand. I don't understand why people are saying that. What is going on?
And anything else they needed to destroy the Bolshevik movement. The United States also imposed economic blockades immediately following the October Revolution as an attempt to starve out the new Bolshevik government. And although the United...
Wait a minute. Once the side that America ends up funding and supporting fails, they try to implement brutal blockades in an effort to starve out the population for the crimes of going against our wishes. I mean, back then, America also was not like a massive power player either, by the way. But it's interesting that it's very one note.
The United States had to ally with the Soviet Union during World War II to defeat Nazi Germany. The Second World War II came to an end. The Soviet Union became enemy number one until its unfortunate demise in 1991. Alright, let's go through these as fast as possible. In 1948, the United States enacted the Marshall Plan, giving loads of funding to Western European countries after the war to rebuild. But nothing went to the Eastern European countries or victims of Imperial Japan, who faced the brunt of the death toll, including 20 million Chinese people, which no one seems to ever mention. In March of the same year, the United States and its Western European allies enacted a trade embargo of advanced technology like computers to the Soviet Union.
Okay, to be fair though, had they considered not being led by the nationalists rather than pushing them out all the way into the island of Formosa, rather than, be controlled by a communist government, which would, of course, potentially align itself with the Soviet Republic. I'm just saying, the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence was growing, and that's genuinely devastating for America's interests. So I don't think that's an appropriate thing. So yeah, no, even if you have 20 million that die, okay, under brutal imperial Japan's horrifying war crimes, okay, ultimately you don't need that money. You can deal with it on your own.
Union, drastically limiting their ability to rebuild post-war. The next year, in 1949, NATO was established, which today seems to be understood as some sort of world police, but was originally designed with the sole purpose of intimidating and combating the USSR and their humanitarian efforts across the globe, stopping any potential expansion into Western Europe. The next year, in 1950, Radio Free Europe, an anti-communist radio broadcast, was founded, designed to expose Soviet citizens to Western ideas and spread lies about both communism and Western capitalism in hopes of creating dissent within the USSR. And in June of the same year, the famous proxy wars began. First, in Korea.
The free nations have learned the fateful lesson of the 1930s. That lesson is that aggression must be met firmly. Appeasement leads only to further aggression and ultimately to war.
Our worst gay president. Abraham Lincoln, our best gay president. Truman, our worst gay president.
Following World War II, Korea was split between the US and the USSR. But when talks of reunification were widespread throughout the country, the United States installed a far-right authoritarian anti-communist president, famous for his suppression of left-wing movements and the Jeju Uprising, where 14,000 civilians were killed by the US-backed South Korean government. This obviously caused the USSR-backed DPRK, or North Korea, to invade South Korea, as its people were being suppressed by the United States.
They were being ruthlessly slaughtered by the US-backed leadership.
Though left-wing ideas and talks of reunification were widespread throughout the country.
Also, speaking of Jeju, something that's really interesting about Jeju Island, aside from the fact that it was one of the areas that even the Republic of Korea at the time basically allowed to have people's committees and whatnot. Blowback, shouts out to Blowback Season 3. Until they decided that it was actually too problematic and there was guerrilla warfare, and they brutally suppressed it by, mass executions and all that good stuff. Jeju Island also happens to have, considering how, from what I understand, we've talked extensively about the misogyny in Korea. Jeju Island has a unique history where, what do you call it? There is a matriarchal family structure. It's one of the places in Korea that, in South Korea, that has a matriarchal family structure on Jeju Island, even though it's basically like, its old remnants are almost entirely destroyed at this point, but the female divers, yeah, the diving ladies. The sea women, Hanyo. Did I say it right? It's the matriarchal structure that they have where women go dive and the men stay at home. Oh, my brother in Christ never thought What? How about James Buchanan? I'd say Buchanan is the most iconic gay president, but also the worst Lamau. My brother in Christ never thought I'd see the day I disagree with you. Wait, about what?
Just in the north. And after 3 years of brutal warfare, where the US carpet-bombed the entirety of North Korea, targeting infrastructure, farms, government buildings, entire villages of innocent civilians, the war came to a temporary end with an armistice agreement. I don't have as much time as I would have hoped to go into the full.
And in the process, they thought about, using multiple nukes both on North Korean soil. Instead, they just napalmed it, used biological chemical warfare, some of which they learned from the Japanese collaborators that they allowed to roam free without any sort of additional legal scrutiny for their war crimes that they committed in Manchuria. They also fantasized about using multiple nukes, both in North Korea, but then also in China as well. Yeah.
Full depth of Korean history, so I advise you to please look into it if you don't believe me. We then moved to Vietnam, where its people were attempting to achieve liberation and independence from France and other Western powers.
Also unacceptable.
But the United States had other ideas. However, the USSR supported them in their independence movement. Are you noticing a theme here? After 20 years of that brutal war, a war so unnecessary and resource depleting that it caused mass social change in the United States and across the world, we decided to venture into the Middle East, into the beautiful socialist country of Afghanistan. The United States funded and assisted insurgent movements like the Mujahideen as an attempt to overthrow the already existing Marxist government of Afghanistan. This led the USSR to send 100,000 troops into Afghanistan to assist the socialist government in their fight against these rebel groups. You're noticing a theme, right? The United States couldn't care less about Afghani rebel groups, or French collaborating Vietnamese people, or even Ukrainians today. The United States' entire goal in these proxy wars was to fight against the liberation of people under colonial rule, as once achieving emancipation they would side with the USSR, a nation who is actually supporting them in their emancipatory efforts. Socialism didn't work in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, in Korea, not because socialism never works, but because socialism never works when you have the United States empire actively fighting against it by any means necessary. And don't even get me started on South America, a continent where between 1950 and 2019, the US supported 56 right-wing military interventions, all of which were to oust a left-wing government who sought to expel parasitic and destructive American companies. And yes, it happened in 2019, when the country of Bolivia tried to nationalize their lithium reserves. Elon Musk, someone who relies on cheap lithium reserves, pressured the United States to orchestrate a coup to oust the new Bolivia.
I mean, I don't know how much Elon Musk individually had a say in this process, to be fair. Like, I think he was just flexing and being a douchebag, but I don't think he was like individually, he was like, yeah, we have to coup Bolivia because of lithium extraction.
Bolivian president. And the same president, Evo Morales,
I mean, who knows? He might have more of a say now in the upcoming administration. I mean, he certainly will have more of a say now, but
just survived another assassination attempt. They can't get rid of the.
But ultimately, the thing is, it doesn't necessarily matter because it's in line with the interest. It's in line with capital interest. That's it. That's what matters the most. That's what matters the most. And by the way, as always, Bolivia was presented as a people revolting against the brutal dictatorship of Evo Morales. Every single time there's any sort of minor mobilization against any kind of government that America considers to be a threat or a foreign adversary, our media immediately runs to say, oh, look, the people are finally rising up. And then, even if it fails, and in some instances it does fail, okay, and the people actually do engage in popular mobilization against a coup, okay, that America is backing, there's rarely ever any coverage over the matter. It's like it's already resolved, you know? We already figured it out. We already know what happened.
This man. But there is a silver lining in all of this. The United States can put its grubby little hands wherever it chooses to put them. Squash whatever sort of movement that has any chance of limiting their global control. But what they can't do is beat resiliency, determination. In 1953, when Cuban revolutionaries violently took back their country from U.S. economic control, chasing out the U.S.-backed fascist leader, the United States immediately cut all ties with Cuba, not allowing them to do any business with American companies.
My mom trying to romanticize Fidel Castro and Che, you are a moron. They killed so many innocent people. Yeah, it's really messed up. It's really messed up, dude. You're so right. How dare I do that? I'm a Batista enjoyer myself. They were also extremely racist. Yo, just like that. On the note, first of all, imagine being an American and saying Cuban leadership was extremely racist. Like, the Cuban revolutionary leaders were extremely racist. Literally, what are you saying? We're talking about the 50s in America. Hello. Okay. Number one, you're wrong. You're just genuinely wrong. Many people just simply point to not Fidel Castro, Che Guevara's writings early on when he was legitimately, he had like racist opinions. He spent the rest of his life liberating African nations from colonialism. You have done nothing to help black people. You are currently defending the American government, who was infinitely more racist than the anti-feudalist revolutionary actions that these guys engaged in Cuba, okay? While simultaneously talking about a guy who directly took up arms to engage, to help African nations against being victims of colonialism for the rest of his life. Ridiculous. Ridiculous making this statement. There is not anything, there's nothing that is further away from reality than this.
Luckily, they had the USSR and were able to succeed as a socialist state all the way up until 1991 when the USSR fell. This period of time became very difficult for Cuba. They didn't have a greater power looking out for them from across the world, but they were resilient. At this point, Cuba was nearly 100% literate, and now that they had to be even more self-reliant than they already were, Cuba began educating its people en masse, with only 10% of the population attending college at the time of the USSR's collapse, to now when nearly 40% of all Cubans are enrolled at a university. This Cuban resilience and their dedication to education has been a monumental success. Cuba now has the most doctors per capita of any country, with 9 doctors for every 1,000 people, which, unsurprisingly, has allowed Cuba to invent vaccines.
That's really unacceptable. I mean, honestly, what they've done to the profit motive is truly heinous.
Vaccinations even the United States has yet to figure out. The COVID pandemic was uniquely difficult for Cuba, since people like Bill Gates refused to make public their vaccine blueprints, and Cuba couldn't buy the vaccines from the United
I gotta go pee.
States either, so they were forced to create their own COVID vaccine, and ultimately experienced a significantly lower death toll than the United States. This country gets terrible press, but North Korea has also been resilient. It's a similar story to Cuba's. North Korea was able to find success after the Korean War thanks to help from the USSR. But they too understood they couldn't be reliant on the USSR. So they went through 2 decades of rapid industrialization, focusing on self-reliance. However, when the USSR inevitably dissolved, North Korea hit a plateau and struggled to develop further. And due to American sanctions, they experienced severe famine throughout the entire country in the 1990s and 2000s. But nowadays, North Korea has a new power looking out for them. Actually, they've been doing a lot of business overseas this country. Not the sort of business the United States engages in, almost the opposite. And that power is China.
We do have some breaking news. There are satellite images, and what they appear to show is rapid construction at several suspected silo fields in China that could eventually launch nuclear weapons. Tensions are rising in one of the most hotly contested regions on the planet, the South China Sea. From militarized artificial islands to fighter jets and warplanes, China's heavy presence in the disputed region is putting the U.S. and its allies on notice.
China and the United States both have been getting involved in other countries. But instead of the United States strategy of war, oppression, and total military takeover,
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq.
I think, like, for a lot of people, whenever there's any sort of whenever there's any sort of promotion of like countries that are outside of the sphere of American influence, outside of the sphere of direct capitalist influence, it's oftentimes talked about with it's often talked about like oh, they have to be perfect. Like, they're not. Even within revolutionary actions, there's always going to be a lot of issues. There's going to be violence. There's going to be innocent people that are also killed, right? For sure. I mean, this is, and there's also going to be issues of governance in the aftermath as well, partially as a consequence of the brutal sanctions regime implemented in an effort to punish. Or even when people go, oh, the intimidation China does to the Philippine government is uncalled for, though. Like, that's another example, right? Like, there are definitely things that other governments outside of the sphere of American influence engage in. I think that the threatening of the Philippines by the Chinese government is minor in comparison to other things that you can talk about with respect to like Myanmar, how China operates in Myanmar. Totally self-serving, arming both sides depending on what their immediate needs are, right? Having said that, however, I think that it's not the expectation that we place upon, like, the expectation we place upon countries that are outside of the sphere of American influence is that, like, they have to be perfect. They're not. Of course they're not. No government is perfect, right? And I've never made that argument that they are. But what I find really funny is that, like, people always just immediately hyper focus on all of the issues within the way that these governments operate, within the way that they've historically operated, especially throughout tumultuous times when they're rebuilding, right? While completely being negligent to America's global dominance for the past century almost. And it's like ridiculous. If you are, I mean, the example is this. China engaged in mass surveillance and re-education in the Xinjiang region against Uyghur Muslims. They considered them to be separatists, extremists. Were there separatist extremists amongst the Uyghur Muslims? Certainly, of course. Having said that, the Chinese government's attitude was completely unacceptable. Okay? I've never defended that at all. But when you hyper-focus on that, without recognizing what American leadership has done historically to Muslims all around the world, okay, it is like, it sounds laughable It sounds ridiculous. Like, if you think that that is completely unacceptable, which I do, then holy shit, you should be losing your mind every day with like what America does that you don't even think about. You don't even consider. Do you understand? Like, we never have that same standard applied that we do to our foreign adversaries. We never apply those similar standards to ourselves. And many people turn around and act like I am the one who's not applying any standards whatsoever to America's foreign adversaries, when I clearly do apply standards to America's foreign adversaries.
To free its people and to defend the world from grave danger.
China has been going about it a different way, known as the Belt and Road Initiative. In order to expand global trade, China realized that investing in underdeveloped countries would allow said countries to spend,
but never in its own country, thus creating an illusion of justice. That's also wrong. America never dominates in its own country is so laughable. The problem is American dominance on U.S. soil is invisible, and it's backed by a massively successful press apparatus that is also seen as invisible, both historically with American dominance against Native Americans or chattel slavery, but even in contemporary American society where we are so brutal, so ruthless to the poor. Like, I'm not even talking about the indigenous people when I talk about like American dominance against, you know, entire, not explicitly like Japan concentration camp in the U.S. I mean, state violence via evictions through capital prisons. Exactly. I feel like the American government does untold amounts of structural violence, but that is completely invisible is my point. It's not seen as like direct violence. Whenever there is some sort of direct violence, like whenever there's any sort of like direct violence, it's always done in the hands of the police, for example. So it is normalized. It's considered to be like totally valid, totally appropriate. We talk about camps, for example. We talk about gulags and whatnot. America has the highest prisoner per capita on the planet. We have, behind bars, a quarter of the entire planet's prisoner population. A quarter. 1 out of every 4 person that is currently jailed behind bars is jailed behind bars in the United States of America. We still have legal slavery in the United States of America. It's legal as a mechanism of punishment. As a matter of fact, the state I'm in right now, the state of California, voted to reaffirm that right to continue utilizing slavery in the state of California as a form of punishment in this last election cycle. California is supposed to be so woke and so progressive. This is the problem. American violence is always invisible, is brushed aside, or the people that we enact this violence against, our own neighbors, deserve it. That's what we're taught to think. When our foreign adversaries do it, it's unimaginable cruelty. That's why I always joke around and say, like, I love those memes about, you know, talking about American society like I'm Yeonmi Parks, but for America. You know?
money on China, investing in ports, highways, airports, railways. These investments help both the country receiving the investment as well as China. Some people criticize China for the Belt and Road Initiative, claiming that it ties down poor countries to China, forcing them to pay back loans that their unstable economy makes difficult to pay back. But what would you rather have? A global power invading your country and changing the government leadership overnight to crack down on left-wing liberation movements? Or a global power investing in your infrastructure, with the purpose of your country being able to better participate in global trade, ultimately growing your economy and creating opportunities that had not previously existed? Socialism has
loans, by the way, that even American capitalists have come to recognize are infinitely more favorable in their conditions than the Chinese loans. Something that we're trying to fix here in the West is by trying to offer better loan conditions.
Has worked. It worked for every country that's tried it.
Yeah, 17 different loans were forgiven by China.
The inevitable reaction by the United States. But when people try to argue that socialism never works, they're really admitting that as long as there is a global network of American-backed leaders, allowing for the continuation of America's pillaging of the Third World, as well as a vast collection of American military bases all across the world, socialism can never work. It is always in the best interest of imperialists to squash anti-imperialist movements, especially when that movement is taking place on the largest deposit of crude oil in the entire world. Thank you for watching North Star Radio. Peace and love. Free Palestine.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably.
Oh, man.
But it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from...
Did you mean wage slavery or prison complex slavery? No, prison complex slavery, not wage slavery. Wage slavery is a separate one that we also try to talk about and try to abolish. How the U.S. destroyed more than socialism in Chile. Project Cybersyn by cool former right, now socialist YouTuber overzealous. No, I don't want to do that. Are you stating that the loans handed out by China are more fair than the ones handed out by our financial institutions or the loans given out by U.S. to other countries? No, I'm talking about the IMF and the World Bank.